Hello and welcome to the Sandeep Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandeep Roy Show.
100 years ago in 1924, Indian history changed forever. John Marshall, Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, informed the world that 4,500 years ago, around the same time as the Mesopotamian civilization, there was the Indus Valley Civilization in South Asia. Since then, we've all grown up with the same images of the Harappan Civilization, the Great Bath, the so-called dancing girl, the bearded priest king. But since the script had not been deciphered, we could only guess at what stories the images on its seals were trying to tell us. What was the basis of this civilization? Who ruled them? Why did it vanish? Where did these people go? Are there traces of Harappan culture we carry forward without even realizing it? A new book looks at Harappa through a different lens altogether, not history or archaeology, but mythology, to understand what made this civilization tick, joining the dots between the pictures we see on the seals. Devdutt Pattanaik's Ahimsa, 100 Reflections on the Harappan Civilization, offers us a new way to look at an old civilization. Devdutt Pattanaik, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Before we get into the Harappan civilization, and I'm saying this because even though our listeners can't see it, you're sitting in front of these drawings. And that made me think your own illustrations have always been part of your books. But this book is literally structured as one page of illustrations and one page of text. How has it been for you coming out as an artist?
For 30 years, I've been illustrating my books. And it would annoy me a lot that during interviews, I would be told, who does your illustrations? And I would say, but the cover page always says illustrated by the author. It's there in every book. But I guess nobody reads the cover page. And I think this time I expressed this in one of the conferences and my publisher heard it and said, okay, this time we're going to write written and illustrated by Devdutt Pattanaik. Only, of course, in this, the art is very evident. It's not just a supplement. It's very much complementary to the text because I felt it's a very complex topic. I wanted to simplify it, reach out to younger audiences, and also help them imagine how this world would be, the way I see it and how I imagine it. And I think it helps people when you give them some visual cues, references. Also, I didn't want to use those same old photographs of seals, which you get in every textbook. And they're so boring. And I said, let me give it, some, because when you give it expression, you give it life. Of course, you're taking creative liberties, but then this is not a science textbook. This is meant to just stir the imagination of readers.
And the interesting thing about the images here is that with the Harappan civilization, we just have the images on the seals, the figurines, because we don't understand the language. What was that like for you when you talk about stirring the imagination? Because so much of mythology is about words and stories. And here you need to join the dots from the images that are out there to imagine the stories.
The primary purpose of this book was not the civilization per se, but focusing on the mythology. I'm very clear I come from the realm of mythology. I'm not a historian. I don't want to be a historian. History plays an important role in my work, but it is mythology. And mythology, by definition, is how a culture imagines itself. And we get access to that imagination through three things: stories, symbols, rituals. Now, typically, we get stories in most cases. We get images in a lot of places. Rituals, if you're lucky, you will get access to. But let's say I'm studying Greek mythology. I don't have access to rituals because it's old, it's ancient Egypt. I have the symbols, I have the stories, but I don't have the rituals. In case of Harappa, I don't have stories, I don't have rituals. I just have these arts, artifacts, architecture. Art doesn't exist in a vacuum. And I wanted to see what can it reveal. I'll give you an example. If you meet a person who is very organized, you know something about his personality, right? He's a very organized person. He loves Excel sheets. His house is well clean. And then you meet someone whose house is disorganized and everything is all over the place. And you can say something about that person. Now, the same applies to culture. The same applies to Harappa. One can never be sure. You can go back in time in history. That's the problem. It's not a science per se. You can't go back and verify. But at least you can tell people how to approach it. Because I saw some of the writings and I felt it was too material. It did not go into the psychological realms too much. They use words like ideology, but I think historians are terrified of imagination. Their training doesn't allow them to look at things metaphorically. So they look at things literally. And I just wanted next generation of scholars to just open up the Pandora's box. There are different models out there.
But as a mythologist, did you find it unnerving to not have the stories that were already out there that you could look at, read, analyze, or did you find it liberating in a way?
Now that you say it, yeah, it is fairly liberating. Egyptian mythology is a case in point. There is very little in terms of stories. Very little. What you find is an artwork, and people keep forgetting Egyptian art does not change. I mean, it does change in a minor way, but in a major way, in a broad sweep of time, for 2,000 years, almost 3,000 years, it doesn't change. How can you have a culture where the design doesn't change over 3,000 years is something tells you about those people. The absence of creativity, the prohibition of individuality. And it tells you that, the Egyptian civilization is a highly controlled civilization. Visuals tell you a lot if you are trained in it, if you sort of are taught to see things, which many people don't, unfortunately. But if you go around our cities, you see how post-independence buildings are very Soviet in structure. They lack character. They are brutal. They are functional. And it tells you something about the architects who built it and where the architects came from. What were their patrons? What were their patrons seeking? We don't see those buildings with embellishments, with cupolas or pavilions or pillars. One of the purpose of the book was to help people see art, because historians, as we know it today, are also favor the text over archaeology. And in archaeology, they are unable to read imagery. And it's a thing which I realized when I studied architecture and I started working on art. I talked to art historians and I realized when they would describe an image, they would give a lot of information, but the spirit of the image would be missing. I would find that in historians who would talk about temples and mosques, and they would not be able to capture the emotions. Like, what does a temple filled with images of gods and goddesses in anthropomorphic form, in fantastic form, tell about a culture? And when it is replaced by a mosque that does not allow human figures and fantastic figures and prefers calligraphy and geometry, what is the shift in mindset? And this I never found historians write about, because they're entering the world of metaphor, which terrifies them.
Well, I think it also terrifies us in terms of images, because you and I may both look at the same image and come back with an entirely different feeling. Whereas the text, when it's written down, it's almost written in stone, as it were. And it's, we can all take it literally.
But not quite. Think about it. A poetry is written, but a poetry is full of metaphors and figures of speech.
That's why we fear poetry a lot more.
So you see, when you read even an Ashokan edict, it has metaphors embedded in it. The location of that it is only located in a trade route, that it is only located in places where imperial power has to be presented, itself tells you so much. And we do not want to see it as political propaganda, because we have decided that you have a noble, sage-like king. And therefore, your interpretation gets muddled. I have seen this with historians who try to present the violence of Ashoka in contrast with the violence of Yudhishthira. And they are looking at two texts. One is a Sanskrit text, one is a royal edict. And when you're reading the Yudhishthira's violence and his regret after the Mahabharata war, someone forgets that this is a piece of literature. and not a royal edict, and that a literature is trying to give a more theoretical construct than a royal edict, and that little details like Yudhishthira's remorse is not about violence as much as violence against family, which only comes across through storytelling. So when you compare the two violence, it's apple to oranges, because killing for ambition while killing for justice, not the same thing. So I've read these essays, seen these videos of extremely reputed scholars, both on the left and on the right. And these fine details are missing. I think that's what mythology brings to the table. It allows you to empathize with the imagination of the storyteller and the writer and the artist. And it's not just opinion. You have to compare, contrast, and give why you choose one particular interpretation over the other. You have to build a case for it.
Let's build a case example. For example, you have a clay tablet in the book which shows there are two men who seem to be fighting with trees, and there's a woman standing in between them as if trying to separate them. And next to it, there's a man on a tree and a tiger below. What dots can you join there when you're confronted with an image like that?
You don't just look at the image, you also look at the material used and how it was done. For example, we know it's a seal. That means it can be reproduced again and again like a copy machine. Why is a seal being made? Why is it copied? For whom is it copied? Are questions that start emerging. We know historically, and this is where I depend completely on archaeologists, that these narrative seals, which can be used to make imprints on clay, start appearing in the slightly later part of the Harappan civilization, not the early part. The early part, the seals have just a single animal. Then they have these narrative seals. And in the final phase, they only have the script. And then gradually the script disappears and geometric symbols appear. So there is a kind of a timeline to the appearance of this narrative. It is not day one. It doesn't begin with that. It begins with a civilization which didn't need narratives, to at least in this format. And one day they felt the need for it, and then the format goes away. So it's there only for a finite period of time. Now, what are they trying to communicate? Because these are narrative seals. These are not just a character. There's something happening in the story. There is a plot. It's so tiny because these images are barely 10 centimeters or 7 centimeters. And typically, when you see artwork of the similar period in Egypt or in Mesopotamia, you find unbelievable levels of violence. Heads being chopped off, hands being chopped off, mountain of heads. It's not just violence, it's terrifying violence. And I started asking myself the question, why is that imagery not there here first? That's the first question. We don't find such human-to-human violence and glamorizing the violence here. The next thing which struck me was this image of separation of two people fighting is again not found in other cultures. So that's significant. But then when you start reading the interpretation, it's typically said two men fighting over a woman. It's too tiny to know who is holding whose hand. And why do you jump to the conclusion that she is a territory over which these men are fighting? Is it our patriarchal gaze that is telling us this? Can we not assume that this is a woman, most probably because there are bangles in her hand? Separating these two men who are fighting with the same weapons. So they're fighting either with the same trees or with the same... There are only two such seals and the other one with spears. It's the only human-to-human violence that we see very explicitly. And it's shown with a separation, not a territorial fight. And for me, I think that's significant. This is not seen anywhere else. Initially, I just saw these images. I didn't bother with the rest. But then I realized these are slightly elongated seals. In both these images next to it, there is something to do with tigers. And there is a woman who is half tiger and half human with horns on it. So is it like some goddess, centaur, sphinx? And there's another image of a man on top of a thorny bush signaling to a tiger, which has a very peculiar stance. It is not attacking. It is not defending. It is turning back as if it is not afraid. This turning back is a very interesting motif. And you keep asking this, they're trying to tell us a story. There are tigers here, not lions. Lions appear in Indian art only in the Mauryan period, which is 1500 years later. The tiger is a carnivore. The man is avoiding him, but also trying to connect with him or her. And I think these are talking about human relationships, our relationship with the wild. What struck me was nature, which is wild in tooth and claw, and there is culture, which is trying to minimize that violence, and violence, which is integral to nature and society. We can imagine non-violence. All that came across in these images.
And it occurred to me when I saw that and read your text that it's curious that Harappa has tigers while Ram, in his 12 years in the forest, never encounters one.
Yes. Because you see, Ramayana, when it's being written, it is written to communicate ideas. And if a tiger doesn't lend itself, although Ram himself is called Shardula, which is like a lion or a tiger, depending on how you translate the word, it's not important in the story to have. Even Mahabharata, it does not have tigers. You have a dog which is barking, you have wild animals, you have a serpent attacking you, but you don't really see, Krishna fights a lion for sure. In the Bhagavata Syamantaka story, there is a lion. But otherwise, tigers are, you're right, missing. Although you have a Durga who rides a lion or a tiger, but that's the later imagery. But as per the Ramayana and Mahabharata, it doesn't strike you immediately. Deer is important, but not tiger and lion. That's true. That's so true.
Do you remember when a tiger first appears?
The tiger and lions do appear in the Vedic literature. They are there. There is a reference to claws of a tiger, fangs of a tiger, tiger skin. Shiva is described as covered with animal hide, tiger hide. So there is Rudra, not Shiva. The Vedic god Rudra is associated with it. But encounter with a tiger and lion, you're right, is not there in the Ramayana and Mahabharata, which are amongst the early epics that appear. So that's quite remarkable.
And it's remarkable that it appears in the Harappan seals because I didn't know that tigers were prevalent in that part, but they must have been at that time.
They must have been. And this is a point of controversy because, historically, a historian cannot say that lions existed. Although I must say that I saw a brochure from Pakistan's museums, which had a terracotta image which they argued were lions. And lions generally are on the western side of the Hindu Kush, with a few maybe coming through the passes on the coasts to the Gujarat, Rajasthan area. But generally, although Durga of Bengal is shown riding a lion, lions are typically more in the Persian, as I said, the western side of the Hindu Kush. Tigers are on the eastern side of the Hindu Kush. But royal animal as an emblem is always the lion, not the tiger. It's the lion. So Mauryan period brings the lion. The Persian kings had the lion. Egyptians had the lion. And even Singapore is named after lions, even though there are no lions in Singapore. Or Sinhala, which is Sri Lanka is associated with the lion. Again, no lions. I think they mean the wild alpha cat more than the lion. But again, in Harappa, there is, I think, one thing which reminds us of a leopard-like creature, but leopard is not there. It's the tiger very clearly shown. And also that area at that time, the climate perhaps. Tiger needs a dry forest. It doesn't need a wet forest, except the Sundarban tigers, which are different. They're mangrove tigers and therefore different, but larger.
Yeah, like Bengalis. They're just weird.
But usually, I think dry Jangala area would have tigers. So Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, that area would have had tigers. See, a kingship as an idea in its earliest form really emerges from Egypt. And Egyptian kings, the pharaonic, the lion plays an important. So you'll see these images of Ramesses going on a lion hunt. And then the Persians take it up and say they show images of Persian kings going on a lion hunt. And therefore, the hunting of the lion for several centuries was the metaphor of kingship, which was inherited in India, brought to India in many ways by Maurya, Chandragupta Maurya. And therefore, the Ashokan pillar has the famous lion and not the tiger. Even China has the symbol is the lion. The male and female lion is kept outside the forbidden city to show power. So it's a power symbol more than anything else.
And yet you write that the Harappan civilization was not an empire of warlords and kings. It was a creation of merchants, probably regulated by monks. How do we know that?
My previous book was on Jainism. And I wrote on Jainism a lot. It's called Bahubali and 63 Insights. And I've always wondered, why would a monastic order be always linked with merchants? Let's take the case of Jains and Buddhists. Now, these beliefs come to India almost 1500 years after Harappa. So let's clarify that, because some people try to misquote as usual to say that Devdutt is saying Jainism and Buddhism started in Harappa. Not true. That's not true. 1500 years after Harappan civilization, you find this Jainism and Buddhism. And what is not told to us, while everybody focuses on their otherworldly ideologies, we forget that they were patronized by merchants. That's the first point. So wherever there are merchants, there are these monks. And there is a close relationship between them for various reasons. One of them being the easiest way to avoid war is by trading. So Ahimsa is linked to trading. Ahimsa is not Gandhian non-violence, non-cooperation. Ahimsa is not vegetarianism. These are lazy definitions. These are political definitions. But from a very practical point of view, if my neighbor is hungry, he's going to attack me. There's going to be raids. So I make surplus, and then I say that you take the surplus, and that becomes exploitation. Why should I make surplus for you? And that's also violence. And then finally the guy says, someday we say, okay, I have something to give you and you take. And so you have hunters giving foragers meat and the foragers giving them plant products. War is averted. And I think Ahimsa is closely linked to a mercantile thought. Having found seals which are talking about Ahimsa, having seen that the civilization really thrived on trading, the cover of the book is lapis lazuli, a stone that is only found in Afghanistan, which makes its way down the Indus River, up the Makran coast of Pakistan, to the Persian Gulf, to Mesopotamia, because of the Harappan merchants. So suddenly you have that mercantile community, you have Ahimsa as an idea, all coming together in my head, and more importantly, the absence of weapons, the absence of an army, no glorification of violence, and an obsession with precision of measurements. Merchants are very particular about measurements because you have a pan balance found in Harappa. They are obsessed with fairness, weight, measures. It's something which is unique. In fact, scholars found across this vast region for over 500 years, these people use the same measuring system. If you go to Mesopotamia in the same period, it's much smaller. There are many cities, and every city has its own measuring system, indicating very individualistic, violent city-states, as compared to a relatively regulated, institutional. It sounded very like what I call SEZ, Special Economic Zone. The more and more, the feeling that you got was of a people who love profit, who love trade, who love business, but who also know that to regulate business, you have to regulate greed. And when I saw those images of what people call Pashupati or Shiva, I started re-looking at these images and I realized that it quite possibly was the regulator. The unicorn seals was of a regulator. And the regulator's power, and this is something I owe to a scholar known as, I think, David Miller. In the 1980s, he wrote a paper where he argued the case, and of course, he's been sort of sidelined by historians, that power is not always obtained through violence or by hoarding resources or by intimidating people with monumental architecture. It can also be done by the opposite, through renunciation, which is something Indians are familiar with. The monk is feared, admired, and I'm wondering whether, as in the Buddhist case and the Jain case, were the monks enabling the regulation of these businesses?
Maybe not the monk part, but a lot of what you're saying, this merchant state that believes in trade and regulation and law and order, makes it almost sound like thousands of years ago there was a Singapore.
Well, in a way, yes, but not, I don't know about the banking part of it.
Right.
Because remember, Singapore does not have resources. This had factories. All those buildings, those houses that we see are generally workshops. We don't use the word factories. That sounds very industrial. But they were workshops. They were making beads, very precision format. And my argument is that the toilets were not for hygiene reasons, but it is because the workers were not allowed to leave the facilities. And therefore, they were kept inside, and therefore you needed indoor plumbing. And the moment this system collapsed, the plumbing was seen as torture and nobody wanted it anymore, and it just disappeared. And I think while we love the idea of indoor plumbing, For thousands of years, Indians didn't need indoor plumbing. It's only when overcrowding happens and you have large populations that indoor plumbing is necessary and critical for civic. But otherwise, in a large area, in a hot country like India, where you don't have to wear so many clothes, where water is available, you don't really need this kind of hygiene. So I think we have to understand people better to understand these things. I mean, most people talk about Harappan toilets more than trade. And it tells you a lot about how the British, structured the original writing, which scholars have continued till date.
But when you look at these seals, like if a civilization is ruled by kings, the seals, the art tend to glorify that king or victory in war and things like that. When you look at these seals, what do the seals of Harappa glorify?
So the seals can be classified in many, many ways. As I said, there are narrative seals which come later. But the most popular seals that we are all familiar with is the single seals made of steatite. All the seals are made of steatite. It is found only in one place in the northern mountains. It's not found everywhere. So it's highly institutional. If you compare it with the seals of Mesopotamia, it's made of different materials. There are different designs. There are different stories, indicating a lot of individual creativity, which is not there in Harappa. So highly controlled, regulated seals by some authority, which doesn't glorify itself. So that's a point to wonder, how can an authority not glorify themselves? Keep in mind, the Jains are a community which builds temples to ascetics who wander naked. So the rich businessman is constantly being told by his community that you are not as great as the man who gave up wealth. That is your check and balance. Your check and balance is the rich man is not the great man. The powerful man is not the great man. The one who gives up wealth and power is the great man. And I think this is an important idea. It's not found in any other culture. It's a unique feature of India. And it's something that we must talk about. I mean, it's just because it sounds strange, because we just assume wealth and power, because it's a Marxist way of thinking, a capitalist and a communist way of thinking, where everybody is only looking for wealth and power and that's all we want. Indians said, no, while it is important, it is not sufficient. There is more to life than that. And I think this point, so now when you look at the seals again, you realize that they always show images of wild animals, not domestic animals. Even the bull is wild. Bulls are wild. The cow is domesticated. The ox is domesticated, not the bull. Then they have the elephant, which is most probably not domesticated. There is the wild buffalo. There is the tiger. There is the rhino. So wild animals are always shown. But 80% of the seals have this strange animal called the unicorn. And it doesn't exist. It is a fantasy image. It's almost as if every clan has a wild animals. And why wild animals? Because wild animals means I will not be controlled. Why male animal? Domination. This is symbolically, they are communicating their autonomy, their independence, but they all come together only in one seal. All these exact same animals on that famous Pashupati seal. It's not any animal in the forest. It's the animals which are found in the seals. It's not a random animal. So I'm like, and Pashupati murder. It doesn't mean wild animals. It means domestic animals. But these are wild animals. They're found on the seal. That's why I said there is something else happening in that seal which we don't want to see. And everybody knows that as long as the unicorn is there, the seals appear. The moment the unicorn disappears, the system collapses. So the unicorn's appearance and disappearance mirrors the rise and fall of Harappa, which in turn mirrors the rise and fall of Sumerian civilization. So there is something else happening over here. And this unicorn, which is the most prevalent image, is found, these seals are found near gateways. And very clearly, these are financial documents like licenses, like registration papers, like tax invoices, like some form of rent, permissions to get raw materials or to take finished goods. The use of a fantasy animal indicates that if 10 people are fighting with each other, you want a symbol. Like nowadays, you will notice many symbols look like the rainbow flag, whether it is the Buddhist groups or everywhere in the world. If you see that everybody wants to use the rainbow flag because there is so much of argument, you start putting all the colors in it because you don't have imagination. And that shows how it's difficult to bring people together. You create fantasy images, animals that don't exist in nature. So we all agree on, and why one horn? When you see a two horn, it's showing an animal which is part of society. And the one horn is important because much, much later in Buddhist scriptures, I found a poetry which said a monk has to live a solitary life, independent, autonomous life, like the one-horned beast. Now, everybody assumes the one-horned beast is the rhino. But I'm asking myself, is it this imaginary creature which is there in the minds of people of a solitary, asexual being? Because there are seals which show unicorn with a womb, and it doesn't seem to be overtly masculine. But more importantly, in China, there is a mythology of a strange one-horned creature which comes far away, maybe from India, which is the symbol of justice and which kills liars and cheats. And then the same creature I found after I published the book is seen by, of all people, Genghis Khan when he enters India. And he sees this creature and this creature says, do not attack India, and he turns around. And this is found in Chinese chronicles. One-horned beast. Everyone says rhino, rhino, rhino. But I'm asking, maybe, because they never say rhino. There is a word for rhino. They say one-horned beast. And I'm like, is it this strange unicorn? And, it's just an idea. And why not? Let's explore it.
Right. Maybe the unicorn was always the divine protector and it has turned its back on us. That is why we are a civilization looking for its unicorn, but we just look for them in the stock market.
Stock markets. No, the funny thing is, spiritually, in the spiritual texts, the Sanskrit texts, there is this concept of Ekapada, the one-legged beast. Ekashringa, the one-horned beast. There is this Eka is there coming repeatedly in the Ekapada, Ekashringa. And it's always associated with the ascetic Shiva, the one-horned beast, the one-horn. It's always related to ascetic practices. It's always related to Shiva. So there's something happening over there, which I feel needs attention.
I actually didn't realize that it's actually 100 years since the British excavated what they call the Indus Valley Civilization. It was 1924.
Yes.
Talk a bit about how that discovery problematized our sense of who we are for historians.
I mean, because it was the 100th year, I decided to write this book in a way, and I think I sort of owe a bit more than I can chew. Because I'd done the illustrations of Harappa 2 years ago, but then I realized that there's so much more there, and it was quite a difficult thing to produce this book. I mean, I really had a bit of a burnout, but the 100 years of history is very important because we forget that when the British came to India, our history was that we had Muslim rulers in the country when the British came. Before that, there was a glorious Indian period. There were the Rajputs, and before the Rajputs, there was the Kali Yuga, which took place somewhere. And before the Kali Yuga, before the Mahabharata war, there was Ramayana. And that was the common history that people just accepted. Nobody thought much about it. That's the way the world was. Historiography and what we call history today is really 200 years old. Of course, in the colonies, history was weaponized. But it happened very insidiously and happened slowly. But they established the Asiatic Society, which translated the texts. That's how Sanskrit was translated by Max Muller. Prakrit was translated. Buddhism was discovered. Suddenly, Ashoka was being discovered because the Pali texts from Sri Lanka were being translated. So, new world was emerging. And it was clear that Brahmins didn't know everything. Remember, they came to a country where they didn't like the Muslim rulers. They hated the Muslim rulers because they were overpowering. They had to topple that. And so they made friends with the Brahmins. And the Brahmins said that we know everything, the Vedas, everything, but they wouldn't share it easily. But the moment the translation happened and the moment all these texts were translated, it was quite clear the Brahmins were clueless about their own past. And then you find the Archaeological Society being set up to find artifacts, because that, again, it was a new subject. People were looking for the Trojan War remains and all these kind of things. And suddenly you search and you find Ashoka. So he becomes a historical Ashoka who is not there really in the Puranic literature, in Ramayana, Mahabharata. Suddenly pops up. Fo, there's a character called Fo, which the British talk, and they discover he's Buddha. And he's just a little bit before Ashoka. So now you have a history of India, which is 2,500 years old. And then now suddenly you have the discovery of these seals, which look very similar to Sumerian seals, which pushes the history of India to 4,500 years ago. And we know nothing about it. And of course, again, the Brahmins want to claim the Harappa as a Vedic civilization, even though it's completely urban. There are no lions, there are no horses. I think the loss of power was huge because you were the keepers of knowledge. You knew everything. You had access to the Vedas. Like once upon a time, the Bible claimed all the knowledge is there in the Bible. And the power of the Bible went away with because history showed that there is so much more natural history, dinosaurs. And even today in America, the creationism thing goes on because you don't want to accept the Bible is not the end point. And in India, you see the same thing happening with, the Brahmins who insist that the Vedas contain all knowledge. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. But they don't want to listen. And therefore, you have an explosion on the internet of all kinds of theories. And it works, I guess. It is useful for politicians. It's not useful for scholarship.
And for the British, what did the Harappan civilization, what opportunity did it provide in their idea of how to shape the history of the subcontinent they were ruling over?
So these are happening by the time the discovery is made, it's 1920. So we're really 25, 30 years away from independence and the independence movement. So one can give some sinister motives to their interpretations or to the lack of data. I mean, depends on which school you belong to. You can see some suspicious, sinister, white man trying to, or you can say that they just didn't have all the information that you and I have today. But at that time, they came up with the translation of the Vedas suggested a very warrior race with horses and chariots. And the idea of the Aryan race was becoming popular. Racism was an important thesis which was embraced by every European till the Second World War. And then suddenly all those departments vanished. And every white scholar pretends they were not supporting this race theory, right? So that's one thing. This Aryan thing emerges. And obviously there's this idea that, of course, and imagine telling the Brahmins that, just as Europeans are foreigners, you are foreigners too. So now I've got a way to say that you are not indigenous. Again, the Brahmins are feeling on a back foot. So, that's a game that is being played. And then you find the seal and you quickly call it the Pashupati seal and Shiva's seal, which everybody seems to admire, but they don't realize it's structurally very clever because they're coming up with an idea saying these cities were built by Shiva worshippers, forest worshippers, tribals, maybe Dravidians, the Aryans and Dravidian. That is the Aryan-Dravidian conflict that anyway started in the freedom movement, the North and South fighting. So they played this theory. Now I can believe that this could be strategic and mischievous. Because the reason is even today, when a Yuval Harari writes the history of the world, he speaks of the Aryan invasions coming and establishing the caste system. For a historian of the 21st century to make such claims is ridiculous because every historian knows, and thanks to genetic evidence from 2010, we know that what we call the caste system endogamy is 2,000 years old. It is not 4,500 years old. It is not 3,000 years old. It is less than 2,000 years old based on genetic evidence. Second, we know that the Aryan gene enters India only 3,500 years ago, 500 years after Harappa ceases to exist. It's very clear that a new population entered India 3,500 years ago with horses, not just in India, across the world. Horses did not exist in Egyptian civilization. It didn't exist in Mesopotamian civilization 4,000 years ago. 3,500 years ago, all these three spaces have horses, horse-drawn chariots, composite bow, which is only described in the Rig Veda. Nowhere else you have a text. Everywhere else you have artworks, but the text is only found in India. And it's all at the same time, roughly 3,500 years ago. So it can't be just a coincidence.
So this 500-year gap, this inconvenient gap of 500 years, so the Harappan civilization collapses, fades away and we have many theories for that. Climate change, the river moves, trade dries up, the cities collapse. What's your idea of what happened to those people? Because there's a theory out there, and Peggy Mohan, whom we've had on this show as well, has talked about the fact that it is probable that these Aryans who came from the Caucasus with their horse-drawn chariots were male, and they married the women who were already here. And, you can trace those roots by detective work in language. But if these women were already here, were they the remnants of the disappeared Harappan civilization? Were their men killed off by the Aryans? What civilization was that for 500 years?
So first, you said the Aryans came from the Caucasus. They didn't. Caucasus is a mountain between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. And that thesis that they came from there emerged because of Max Muller and the 19th century. The Indians were arguing that the Aryans came from India, the eastern end of the Aryan civilization. The Europeans were saying they came from Europe, and so they came to a compromise, and they said Caucasus, which is right in the middle. And by the way, the impact of it is so much that even today in America, white male is called a Caucasian male. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because in the biblical historians who see Bible as history, which it is not, said that the Noah's Ark was found in the Caucasus mountain, and therefore all white people have to come from there. The horses were domesticated north of the Caucasus, and this has been proved through genetic studies in the region of the Volga and the Don. So it's southern Russia, Ukraine really, where they found, and then they spread in the eastern western directions. The earliest chariot is found west of the Ural Mountains, in Sintasta, and so that's fairly good academic research has been done even before the genetic studies emerged. That around 2000 BC is when this revolution is taking place. Now, what happens in India? You have the cities go away, but the people are still there. The farmers are there, the fishermen are there, the potters are there, the herdsmen are there, the jewel makers are there. It's just the cities and the big factories and these merchant clans sort of have withered away. It's not that it's gone and disappeared. The knowledge is still there to the point that we know that even today, some of the measuring systems we use come from Harappa. No doubt about it. Masala, which was used in Harappa, is still eaten today. Oil that was used in Harappa is still used today. So it's things of the culture still survives. But what would have happened is more probably these people migrated southwards along the coast, and if you travel from the coast from Gujarat, you can come down to the Konkan, from Konkan to Goa, you can come right up to Palghat and then sort of move towards the eastern part of India. Or another group, the northern group, the Punjab group would have moved towards, because that migration seems to be very strong to Rakhi Gadi. Rakhi Gadi is Haryana, and from there, obviously Gangetic Plain is right there. It would have been a huge forest at that time. 500 years is 20 generations. So some memories would have survived. Some memories would not have survived. As per the genetic scholars, it's Y chromosome which comes. And usually for trade and these kind of things, the men would come. And there is a reference in the Vedas repeatedly to bands of single men. It's like the second son phenomena in Europe. The eldest son would inherit everything and the second son had nothing to do. And I think in many ways, those who did not have opportunities would take their horses looking for new markets. And it was a new military technology, right? The composite bow, the spoked wheel chariot, and these horses. And they came with this technology and they came to India. And the thing about India is that it's rich land, fertile land. Why to go back? And now, obviously, the question is, how did they marry these women? Was it force? Was it coercion? Did they kill the men? All is possible. India is a very large country. So many things are there. And we know much later in the Manusmriti, elaborate lists of different ways to marry is there. And men are told you should produce children, and you are told sometimes you buy a wife, sometimes you abduct a wife, sometimes you even, unfortunately rape a woman to get her. And there are many, many stories in the Mahabharata, again written much later. But the Mahabharata tells about a man coming with horses and asking the king for his daughter. This is a thesis like the Rishi Richika comes to the king Gadhi and says, I have horses. Can I marry your daughter? Agastya is asked for horses. Yayati's daughter is given in exchange for horses. So the idea of giving horses in exchange for the wife is there. It's, of course, I have to be a little caveat that these stories are written 1500 years later. They may be memories, but since we now consider mythology to be history, then let's consider them history and say that women were being exchanged for horses.
When you say that it's memory, that comes down. Because if indeed these were local women and these men had come from outside, as we all know, generally women transmit stories to their children as whatever, bedtime stories, fairy tales, whatever you might want to call them. So there should be some continuity. When you look at the seals of Harappa and the images there, do you see evidences of that continuity going forward? Are the unicorns coming down?
So most certainly, that's the thing which caught my eye. There is a seal which shows a ship with birds on it. They may have been familiar with the monsoon winds, but that's a big thesis because they travel to Oman and you have to go across open seas to go to Oman. But mostly they travel along the coast. And sometimes your ship can be pushed far away and you wonder which direction is the coast. So what would you do? You would release birds. And the birds would fly up and know where the coast is and go in that direction. This is there, that this image of a boat with these birds is very clearly found in Harappa. And in the Rig Veda, there are verses which talk about the boat with the birds finding the shore. There is a memory of the boats because these boats would have still survived, right? It's not that they've gone away, but they will not be part of the Aryan world. It would be part of the Harappan world or the post-Harappan world, if I might call it. And remember, Rigveda keeps referring to the river Saraswati. It's a river, but the Saraswati that we have today is a tiny Shivalik hills to Rajasthan. It's not the bubbly river it is referred to, but there is clearly a river which is repeated. Even in the Mahabharata, there is reference to a river from the Himalayas, and it always talks about going underground. And if you go to Rajasthan today, there is water under the ground. It's one of those most densely populated deserts in the world, which means the people have figured out how to find water. So there's a belief that there is a river flowing under. And I think that memory is there, and they're talking about this river Saraswati. So Ganga is not an important river in the Rig Veda. Saraswati is, Sindhu is, the Chenab, the Punjab, 5 rivers of the tributaries of the Indus is. And Ganga and Yamuna are just there. The nakshatras, the division of the sky based on nakshatras, with the Pleiades constellation of Kritika, not the zodiac, but the nakshatras, is in all probability a Harappan memory, which makes its way to the Rig Veda. So there is something there happening. The idea of Ahimsa is there in the Rig Veda, again coming. And the whole ritual of the yajna itself, I would argue, comes from an Harappan, because it is about giving and receiving. It's not about raiding. It's about give something to the gods so that they give you something in exchange. And this idea of exchange for me is coming from a trading community. Of course, trade was not restricted to India. It was also there in the Oxus civilization, which is west of the Harappa. So probably they picked up this idea like the Soma. They probably picked it up in Central Asia, this idea, because Soma and the idea of exchange is not found in other Harappan literature. Most importantly is that the Rig Veda has sounds, the retroflex sounds, and this is what Peggy Mohan talks about very beautifully, about how sound like ter, ter, der, her is not found in any Indo-European language. It's only found in India, and they came from the mothers in all probability.
And we are our mother's children, apparently.
We are our mother. We have mother tongues. How much of it will say Pitra Bhumi, it's really Matra Bhumi and Matrabhasha. And I think we ignore women in our histories. Even female historians, they talk about female queens. We do not talk about farming as a woman's occupation. We refuse to see women as outside the home contribute. The unicorns could, for all probability, could be women, because normally traditional imagery of male would highlight the genitals. That absence of it, the use of bangles, the use of beads shows some role of women. We know that it's matrilocal in all probability. Women didn't go to their husband's house. The husbands came to their house, which is common in trading communities. So these are all things that I feel need attention. And I think those who talk about the Aryan civilization and the horse riding and blonde, they always talk of men. And of course, these podcasts and videos that we see are always men who are seeking to be dominant alphas, which they're not, I guess, in real life.
But even though in Harappa's case, probably the most famous image is of a woman, but men have decided that is a dancing girl.
Yes. And I had this girl in one of the conference games, but this is how women stand in a dance pose. And they sing, I said, but this is exactly the way a woman stands when she's quarreling. And she's like making arms akimbo, shouting and screaming. And I said, why can't you see a girl, a petulant girl? By the way, that image is repeated 3 or 4 times, which means it is not just a random pose. It is also has some ritual purpose. And that's an important point to remember. This woman standing, the bangles in her hand, the cup is there even in a potsherd. So there is something more happening. And yeah, we have decided she has to be a dancing girl. And the moment you see a man with a beard and a shawl, we decide that he's a priest king, where there's nothing priestly about him or kingly about him. For all you know, he could be a theatre actor.
But you mentioned that the genitalia are not very prominent in these. Did that surprise you? Other mythology images have a lot more sexuality about them. Was this a prudish civilization?
Not prudish, monastic. The monastic civilizations typically play down on sexuality. Sexuality is a very big thing in military civilizations, where it is about conquest, the man conquering the woman. Even today, when we talk about dating and marriage and boyfriend-girlfriends, you'll notice the combative language being used. I got her, I trapped her, I won her, versus a trading language, which is about what do you give me, There's a story from the Rig Veda and the Mahabharata about a wife called Lopamudra for Rishi Agastya. And when he says, I want you to bear my children, she says, what will you give me in exchange? So, I mean, where are these ideas coming from? Because they're not part of our culture anymore, where a woman is asking for remuneration in order to give the man the children that he wants to repay his debt to his ancestors. So this idea of trade is something that is there. And I think trading civilizations downplay sexuality. Military civilizations tend to amplify sexuality. The Pashupatas, which India is famous for, the Shiva worshippers, really came at a time when military conquests were becoming important, and kings, like in the Southeast Asia, the Devaraja kings loved the idea of this macho Shiva. And even today you see the masculine, macho, six-pack ab, muscular gods with people, those Brahmins who want to be Kshatriyas and want to fight. But we all know that the country is controlled by trading communities. At the end of the day, the political masters bow in front of bankers and traders. And I think Harappa reminds us that the Brahmins may think they're powerful, the Kshatriyas may think they're powerful, but the Baniyas are playing the game behind the scenes beautifully.
But at the same time, do you also look for and find evidences of people who disturbed the normal order of things? The transgender, which becomes so much a part of our story about people who straddle worlds, was that there?
So, this is what happens with new scholarship, because people start asking these difficult questions. 100 years ago, perhaps John Marshall wouldn't dare ask this question. Today, we reach in a place where science will ask these questions. And the scholars have asked about the presence of the queer or the androgyne in Harappa. The cities have these figurines. It's not very common. The figurines are not found in all cities. Harappa, Mohenjo-daro have these clay figurines, mostly of women, bejeweled women. And they're these crude images, which are obviously done like some Vrat Katha mein, when we make these idols for pujas and all that, which is very common in India. But amongst these are a lot of statues which look androgynous. So there is a clear genitalia, male genitalia, but there's also jewelry which is female. And bangles. So bangles with male genitalia, and you are wondering, could this be a queer person? Are they communicating? And this is just, again, we can't prove it, but they exist. And the fact that the famous Pashupati seal, he has got bangles in his hand. And if you assume bangle as feminine and, horns as masculine, many of those sacred images are always shown horn with bangle. So this could be...
And bangles usually on one arm, right?
That's in the statue, not in the seals. In the seals, it's always both the arms are filled with bangles. And this could be a different things, right? When you're a young girl, you have bangles in one arm. When you get married, you have bangles in two arms. So these are all ritual practices which are there in India even today. And we tend to see everything in terms of politics and economics. But ritual understanding of practices is important. And I think in many rituals across India, even today, like Tayyam, male dancers dress like women and perform. And you have this, the breasts, metal breasts being applied. And they're very clear the god is androgynous. It's male, female, it's breaking the boundaries. And my argument is that the proto-monk of these periods not only gave up wealth, power, position, relationships, but perhaps even their gender. And that made them objects of integrity, that you trust this person because he's given up everything. And it's not like the Babajis of today who are, step one of becoming businessmen. Because this is the opposite. The step one was business, and then you become a Babaji. So today the Babaji becomes a businessman, but I think in Harappa, the businessmen at one time when they reach the highest level, if you want the chairman's position or you want the regulator's position, you must have the courage to walk away from it all, is what my argument is, because these ideas eventually percolate into India. And I feel these are the ideas which sort of manifest in later day Vedic culture, Buddhist culture, Jain culture. And it's something which is always part of India, but we don't know. 1500 years of silence between those two things makes life a little difficult.
Yeah. But when you think about this with your thesis that this is a trader culture as opposed to a warrior culture, and we find the Harappan trades in the Sumer civilization, but what does it say to you that it seems these are traders who didn't bring back very much with them from the places where they went to trade? You don't find much of Sumer in Harappa.
You just don't. You don't find a cuneiform script. You don't find a single seal. But of course, a trade means it can't be an exploitative movement where only one thing is going one way. We know that animals were being taken, the peacock was being taken, the rooster was being taken. We know that cotton was going, beads, of course, carnelian, red carnelian, blue. But what was coming back is a question mark and nobody's sure. One thing I feel for sure is bitumen. Bitumen is something which is tar, which is not available in India, but Harappans would need bitumen because they're obsessed with their toilets, floors, and for pipes. So I think bitumen has been found also in some places. So bitumen for sure. Everything else Harappa really had. It didn't have metal. But metal really came from the north. It came from the Afghanistan zone. So metal would have come from the tin and copper. Copper also comes from Aravalis. Otherwise, if you look at Harappan civilization, it's fairly self-sufficient. It doesn't really need to trade. Those beads are luxury goods or occult beads, which Sumeria definitely wants because it doesn't have stone. One of the scholars say that sheep is not there in Harappa, goats are there. And so probably one of the imports was woolen textiles because Sumeria was famous for woolen textiles. You exported cotton and you imported wool. And because it's fabric, it doesn't last. And so we don't have archaeological records. So bitumen and wool is for sure coming in because we need it. It is needed. Everything else seems to be more luxury and, good to have, better quality grain, better quality fruit or something, dates and all that, because all that is really also available in some form in Harappa. It's an unbelievably prosperous region. Sindh and Punjab are even today rich reason. There are two rivers, there are monsoon winds, there is metal, animals. So it's quite prosperous, really. It doesn't really need it to trade, which is the reason why when the cities collapse, in fact, they found food production increases, the animals are still there, the herdsmen are still there. It's not, the civilization doesn't collapse, the urban centers collapse. The people survive and wait for the Aryans. And even when the Aryans come, the moment trading starts, urban centers come.
So having looked at all this and tried to put yourself in the minds of the people who made these seals to figure out what the stories and what this civilization would have been like. Devdutt, do you think you would have wanted to live in the Harappan civilization? Would you have been happy there?
Well, not if I'm locked up in a gated community and having to use indoor plumbing and not having the choice to walk out. So that part, I guess, I wouldn't enjoy. But I guess I would love to have sailed along and taken those risky rides to Oman and Bahrain and meet these Sumerians with their painted eyes and jewelry. I think that would have been fun. And, the journey to these foreign lands and meeting these perfumed men with oud.
Because there is a tendency sometimes also to over-romanticize Harappa as this sort of idyllic civilization of equality and fraternity that existed that has gone.
I think if you look at India, you had villages and some people romanticized Indian villages saying self-sufficient units. If you see Gandhi talking about Indian villages as self-sufficient units, but they came from privileged backgrounds. And the moment Ambedkar wrote about villages and he said these were cesspools and dens of, ignorance and discrimination. So how do you see the village? Depends on who you are talking to. And I think that's an important lesson I learned because, this whole idea of the self-sufficient village ecosystem with the panchayat sounded romantic until you started reading mythology and you realized those in the center of the village were not in the periphery. And those in the center of the village were pure and those at the periphery were impure and untouchable. And how do we know this is not there in Harappa? So violence takes many forms. It doesn't have to be the military violence which is valorized by ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. There could be a different form of violence. I think it's called a vertical violence rather than a horizontal violence. So human culture is based on domesticating plants, animals, and human beings. And the process of domestication with rules and regulations is violence because you enforce rules and regulations either through carrot or through stick or through stories. You tell people it is good to obey and they start believing it. Or you tell them if you don't obey, you'll go to hell. And if you obey, you'll go to heaven. And, so these are models and all civilizations. I think the historians have a very poor grasp of human character. And they are fighting amongst themselves. And there is this kind of a universal way of looking at the world. I think the recent prize in economics the Nobel Prize for Economics, has been challenged by economists from China, saying that they are talking about a white man's vision, liberal economy, which was perhaps great 20 years ago. But today, it sounds hollow. So, the economists are challenging these universal models. And I think historians need to get out of the universal models of left wing and right wing, because both of them are following John Marshall and not Devdutt Pattanaik.
We can't. We have to end right there. It's a perfect place to end. So,
why not? If one is imagining and going all the way, let's go all the way and have fun.
Devdutt Pattanaik, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Renowned mythologist Devdutt Pattanaik's latest book is Ahimsa, 100 Reflections on the Harappan Civilization. Find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcasts. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. Thanks for listening. This is Sandeep Roy on Express Audio.